Oh, Suma is there.
Look at the cameras.
Hello, and welcome to the Global Perspectives on Fighting the Coronavirus Pandemic. My name is Sarah Wheaton. I'm the Chief Policy Correspondent with Politico Europe, and I'm joined here today by Carl Bildt. He is the former Prime Minister of Sweden and now the Special Envoy for the ACT-Accelerator, which he will tell you a little bit more about later. Joining us from London is Sir Suma Chakrabarti. He is the former president of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And I have Marko Čadež here. He is the president of the Chamber of Commerce for the Republic of Serbia. So thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of you who are here in the room in Bratislava with us, and thanks to everybody who is watching online. Whether you're in the room or joining us online, you can ask questions using the GLOBSEC app. Or if you're in the room, at some point I'll give you a chance to raise your hand and somebody will come around with a big socially distanced mic and stick it in your face so that you can ask a question. And do think of those questions now. If you wait until the very end to take an opportunity, then we might not get to your question. And actually, on that note, to kind of help everybody get used to using the app, whether you're online or not, let's go ahead and do a poll. This is your chance to weigh in, to give a review to Europe of how well it has handled the coronavirus pandemic. So if we can pull that up for you. So how would you rate the EU's performance on supplying vaccines to EU citizens? One, it's on a scale of 1 to 5, so 1 is terrible and 5 would be excellent. So go ahead and weigh in, and we'll get back to the results a little bit later. But for now, let's kick off just actually looking at what happened over the weekend. The G7 met, and they announced that they will be donating 870 million vaccines to poorer countries over the next 12 months. Meanwhile, as our presence here can attest, things are getting back to normal in wealthier countries. And so, Suma, actually, let me start with you over in London. You know, what do you make of this 870 million dose commitment? Is that going to solve the problem?
Thanks very much, Sarah, and nice to see Carl and Marko as well. I'm actually in Oxford, not London, but anyway, I'll forgive you for that. But look, it's a start, but it's nowhere near enough, frankly, this in terms of vaccine sharing. We know all the analysis, including by my organization, ODI, says that we've really got to get vaccination rates up in the global south in order to solve what is a global problem. And that requires both more vaccine financing, vaccine sharing, and work on vaccine production too. But on the sharing side, look, what the G7 announced, I think, is helpful, but it's way, way short of what the IMF or the Independent Panel on Pandemic Preparedness and Response are saying is needed. A long way short. And of course, with the Serum Institute in India, the largest producer of vaccines, also only producing for domestic use to the end of this year, the gap is enormous. So I'm afraid I don't really think this is going far enough to solve the problem we have.
Carl, what's your take? How do we get where we need to be?
No, I fundamentally agree. I mean, 870, I'm not quite certain it was 870. That remains to be seen. There's always, in a pledging conference of this sort, there's always an element of double accounting, and delivery is what counts, and delivery is needed not next year but this year, these months, in order to get it under control. What we need really to bring the pandemic under control by next year is in the order of 11 billion doses. We have now so far roughly 2.1 billion doses that have been administered around the world, 85% of them in the richer world. If you take the low-income countries, 0.2% of people have been vaccinated there. And as we have learned, the problem, if we go around in Bratislava or Stockholm and Belgrade and think that the issue is solved, that is not the case. Now we are dealing with the Delta variation, I think that is going to be dominant all over Europe within weeks, because it is very much more contagious than the previous ones. And I'm quite certain that if the pandemic continues to rage in wherever in the world, Peru is among the worst at the moment, there will be new variations. And these don't know any borders, they spread very fast. So that is why it's so extremely urgent to get vaccines and diagnostics and treatments out to every corner of the world, because until everyone is safe, no one is safe. We are not safe in Bratislava until we are safe in Bangalore or Botswana or whatever in the world. So G7, lots of words, some promises, good start, but much more is needed.
Thanks, Carl. The other factor that we've been seeing, though, is countries seem to be a little unsure about whether to give through COVAX, which is a mechanism set up by the World Health Organization, by Gavi, that says they will give to kind of distribute vaccines equally around the world, prioritizing health workers, prioritizing need. On the other hand, many countries have said, look, maybe we're ready to give away vaccines or sell vaccines, but we maybe want to get a little something out of it ourselves. We have some diplomatic priorities, and so vaccine diplomacy has also emerged. And Marko, Serbia has been arguably a beneficiary of this. Is vaccine diplomacy a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah, that is really the case. But if you look at the picture, we were very good as a civilization to develop the vaccine which can efficiently, with antibodies, fight the virus. But we are, as a civilization, as a world society, so failing to reach the same in the structural and institutional and the policy levels, where we actually do whatever we have done more or less wrong. If you see Serbia, of course, Serbia as a non-EU member still, and with the opportunities to fight on our own as a small country with a very simple decision-making process, with not bureaucratic administration, it was not so hard. But it was not so hard because the world as a global place, the world politics, made out of this actually a street fight. To be a street fighter as a small country, to be a street fighter which his hands are not tied, it's much easier. So actually what you have done in Serbia is that we started many months ago, so a year and a half ago, to look into the producers and to talk with them directly, to approach them, to buy the vaccines. At that time, we had, of course, our talks with the European Union, with the decision makers in the European Union, and we saw how it's going to lead and how the process will go. So we said, okay, let's do it everywhere. Because, virus, again, biologically, if you see the virus is coming to your lungs, then the antibodies attacks this virus in the lungs. If you see that we have a Delta virus in India, politically and structurally, you are not attacking the India case, you're totally deblocking the world parts which are the most infected. And this is, that's what I'm saying, maybe we need more virologists now leading the world than the politicians.
But the politicians have made some interesting choices with regard to Serbia. We've seen Russia send quite a few vaccines in. We've seen China especially supply vaccines. How have you seen that affect uptake both within Serbia and within the region as well?
So basically what good decision is to say, okay, where we can reach the vaccines. There's the Chinese, there's the Russians, Sputnik, Sinopharm, there is AstraZeneca, there is Pfizer, there is Moderna. And you could, as a citizen in Serbia, and later on the citizens of the region, you can choose which vaccine you want to take. And dependent on this, it could be take 1 week or 2 weeks or 1 month until you are ready to be vaccinated. And that was a good decision because, the virus is not Sinovac or Sputnik or Astra. Virus is a virus, so we have to defeat him. What we then discovered is that alone vaccinating ourselves in Serbia is actually good, but it's not not preventing us. It's not helping us a lot. Let's try to spread it on the region. So we organize as a Chamber of Commerce vaccination of the business people and then later of all citizens from the regional of the Western Balkans, but also from Croatia, from Bulgaria, anywhere. So basically, for us, it was most important. Let's vaccinate as more people as we can to help and to start to live normally. We are not a part again of the European structures as much as we wanted to be. So we have no institutional umbrellas, financial umbrellas that they can give us injection of money and capital and to overbridge the situation. We had to find. We were forced to find our own way, and this is maybe in this situation good, but this is a crisis situation. We now have to see how we can reach out and rebuild the institutions. What are the multilateral organizations are doing? What do we need for the climate change, for the next pandemic? So, and I'm very, very thankful to Mr. Bildt, who is now really shaking the structures. And that is what we needed 2 years ago. Not now, but maybe 5 years ago. But okay, nevertheless now, thank you, Carl, for that. So really to shake up and to see people, it's not about playing the games. It's not about playing the geopolitical and geostrategy with the lives of billions of people.
Carl.
No, Serbia has done it relatively well. I freely acknowledge that, no question about it. But it doesn't really help Serbia, but it doesn't help the world. And in my opinion, there's no way we can sort this out in Serbia, no way we can sort it out in Europe. We need to sort it out in the world. Yeah. And accordingly, we need the global institutions. And to be quite honest, I've never been dealing seriously with these issues before. I've been dealing with things like the Balkans and Russians and God knows what. That's a mess in itself, so we skip that. A couple of months ago, Dr. Tedros called me, the Director General of the World Health Organization, and said, Carl, I need your help. And I said, well, me? Yep, I need someone who needs something about international affairs, and you should now be helping me to coordinate ACT-A. And I said, what's ACT-A? Well, ACT-A was set up April of last year by the G70 and G20, sorry, and the EU, in order to, because at that time they said, gosh, something is happening. We need to get everyone around the table. So we set up a coordinating mechanism that brings together sort of the big multinational actors, the World Health Organization primarily, but also the World Trade Organization, which is key in this particular respect. Then we have a lot of other actors like sort of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, public-private, CEPI that is developing vaccines, INFI that is doing diagnostics, big private actors. I mean, we have some private global superpowers like Gates and Wellcome, all of these in a coordinating network, never been done before. And we meet every week to say, this is what to do, this is the challenge, this is what we're trying to do. Just today we have announced an agreement with the 2 leading manufacturers of medical oxygen in the world to produce an additional 2.2 million, I think, cylinders of oxygen every day. Because if people don't get oxygen, they die. They die. And we've seen them dying in numbers in India, in Latin America, in Nepal. And then you bring everyone around the table, manufacturers and NGOs and governments, and try to do that. Has this been successful? So far not. Well, it has been successful in the sense that we've done a lot. But I'm cautioning everyone. We are not even at the midpoint of this particular pandemic. And we don't know what's around the corner. Because we are fighting a living enemy that is moving, that is adapting, that is changing. And we know what we are fighting today. Perhaps we're not testing enough, in my opinion. So it might be that there is something that we have even today that we don't know. But we can be fairly certain that we're going to fight something else 3 months from now. And then we need to have the preparedness. And at the same time as we are doing these things, I'm not going to talk too long, but we are starting to think of what happens. Say that we, by the end of next year, are in a good situation. Then we need to think, are we really entering a new age of pandemics? Because this might have been the worst, it was the worst, but we've had a number of them during the last 20 years, starting with SARS. We tend to forget that, but we had a number of them. We didn't have action. So is this going to be the beginning of an age of pandemics, or are we going to be ready to set up the international other institutions to make certain that we can prevent new pandemics. And that's going to be a very major global challenge. But first we have to overcome this one.
Suma, I see you've been itching to weigh in.
Politics is alive and kicking in the vaccine field as well, I'm afraid. The G7 committed to support an ACT-Accelerator-led process to coordinate global vaccine supply network and to try and optimize, actually, manufacturing capacities. But it's completely short on concrete commitments. These G7 haven't got any concrete commitments on this, and it's urgent to tackle those bottlenecks in supply chain of the pharma sector and expand manufacturing capacity worldwide. Secondly, I mean, I'll read you a quote from the US in the run-up to the G7. It said it was going to use the G7 to rally the world's democracies around solving this crisis globally, with America leading the way to create the arsenal of vaccines. Well, what I note is the world's biggest democracy, India, is unable to export at all at the moment to the end of the year. China has ramped up production of its vaccines towards, I think, nearly 500 million a month now. And it's going to become the world's largest vaccine producer and maybe actually able to supply significant vaccine numbers far sooner than G7. And there won't be explicit conditionality in this. There doesn't have to be. Simply the fact that in an emergency, your sources of vaccine are coming very much from a country like China will make leaders of emerging markets wake up, take notice, realize who's supporting them in the moment of crisis. The fundamental problem in this is what Serbia has done, what the UK has done, what Sweden, everyone has done, is actually very rational at a national level. But it's not rational globally. That's the problem we've got. So what we've failed to do, I think, is align the self-interest with the collective global interest. And you saw that in the G7 summit, I think, as well. And, you know, I come from a country that, you know, decided to do a Brexit despite the economic consequences. So I'm not going to appeal just to the economic arguments. I think things like lifestyle changes for all of us in the advanced countries will come unless we can get vaccines shared properly with the global south. And that's what Carl, I think, and Marko also saying. And that's the case that politicians in the advanced countries need to make to their populations. And so far, not really being made.
Thanks. And you make a really interesting point, because we've been hearing this mantra that nobody is safe until everybody is safe. But I think, again, we all here who are physically in this room, see some of you in the audience sitting close to each other, not necessarily wearing masks. We all seem to feel pretty safe. And we look back at the AIDS epidemic as well. There sort of a case was made 20 years ago that this type of inequality was not acceptable. And yet we seem to be back in the same place again. So are we gonna start from square one with every pandemic? Carl?
Well, there's a risk of that, but that needs to be avoided. As you said, I mean, we had SARS, we had AIDS, we had Ebola, we had H1N1, we had MERS. There were, as a matter of fact, 11 different international high-level panels in order to say, things are coming, prepare yourself. And the last and most significant of them issued his report in November of 2019, 1 month before. I hadn't read it. I was not even aware of it. I was not in position of responsibility at the time. But anyhow, I doubt there was any prime minister in the world that had read that particular report. But if you read it in afterwards, it's all there. It says it. That means that we need to prepare much better in order to be ready for the next, because there are quite a number of structural factors that make it more likely that these things will happen again. In terms of population explosion and interaction between humans and animals and climate change. And so it's sort of, it's moving towards a word of pandemic if we don't get a word of much more intensified global cooperation on global health issues. I'm saying that as a person who never dealt with these issues. I wasn't aware of them before, dealt with sort of a classical security of a GLOBSEC type. But when we see these things happening, I mean, we have, I don't know how many, have we 4 million dead? I think the official figure is around 3 million, but that's a gross underestimated. We have 15,000 dead in my country. And we've still been lucky. Because if we compare with SARS in 2003, this is far less deadly, more contagious, But if we were to get something that is as deadly as SARS and as contagious as COVID, then we are in much, much deeper trouble than we are today. And it could well happen if we don't learn the lessons.
Thanks, Carl. Marko, you're the president of the Serbian Chamber of Commerce. Business thrives on stability. Obviously, this was deeply destabilizing. How are companies preparing for this going forward?
So I think the companies are now much quicker and smarter than the complicated structures of institutions. If you see, more and more corporations are introducing obligatory vaccination in their system. So you cannot work, sorry, if you're not vaccinated. The companies, if you see, everybody is commenting about the lot of stocks buybacks from the companies. It's not only because of the cash, it is because of the preparation of the vulnerable world. So, of course, as a company, I am consolidating my equity to be able to cope with the new challenges, something which is really, really logical thinking. The companies are also redefining how they trade, redefining the logistical networks. Very, very quickly, the states, the governments on the other side are helping a lot, of course, in the structure to help, to pump the money to make the crisis less dangerous that is. But the answers of how we will cope the next stage, there are no answers. So if you look as a Europe as a company. So let us forget this is a structure. Let us think about European continent as a company. What do we have as debt EBITDA ratio? Huge. What do we have as our social expenditures and costs? More than any other company if we see China and Asia, if we see United States or other companies. The economic dynamic of Asia is much stronger and much vivid than European. The outcome of the Asian economy will surpass Europe in a few years if we continue to work like this. Technological competitiveness, we are lacking behind Asia. We are lacking behind USA. If we see education, overview the list of the educational institutions at the top ratings, you will find maybe UK, okay, but that's it. In the European continent, you will not find the biggest and the more, top-ranking institutions. What is about the fintech? What is about, so there is a lot of issues where I will ask Carl, are you ready to invest as a company in Europe as a company if you be investor? I don't know. I think we need a strong investment fund which will come to Europe and restructure ourselves. Because I'm talking this as somebody who is still not a member of EU, but very integrated, very, very integrated in the European economy. You can be EU or you cannot be EU, but you are part of the economical network of Europe. And I tell you, this, looking from this down, as the smallest fish, I see really all the problems that we are now facing, and this is not easy to solve. And this is what we have to rethink. And this is not only about redistribution of vaccines. We have to think about technologies. Nobody sells, okay, how our large, we as Europe, we are a company which is oriented as an exporter. You agree? So we have to export to other markets, to big markets, to other companies, as India, for example. We have to export to Africa. We have to export to China. We have to export to the United States. And how they will cope, these markets, with their challenges. Are we helping or are we not helping? Technology, fintech, distribution of predictions of and introducing of AI technologies in these countries, healthcare, digital healthcare. So these are the questions that we also have to deliver and to export to these markets in order to have these markets in the same capacity that we want to have them, because we depend on these markets. Mm-hmm. We want to admit it or not, but we depend on it.
Well, if Europe is a business, we all had our chance to do our Yelp, our Google review in our Slido poll. So let's see the results of how folks feel Europe did. All right, very middling. There's strong consensus that Europe had a mediocre performance on supplying vaccines to EU citizens. We're about midway through, so I'll check with the audience to see if there are any questions in the room. All right, I don't see any. So a reminder to get your questions ready here or submit a question on Slido. But Suma, let me ask you. One of the discussions that came up, made especially articulately by the Croatian president earlier today, is this idea that a lot of these restrictions were imposed. The health restrictions were imposed without necessarily a lot of consent from the populace. It might have been, driven by experts, not necessarily done in some sort of authoritarian pursuit. But, how do these restrictions affect economies and kind of the citizens' relationship to their economies?
Well, what we've been seeing for the last 15 months is a classic liberty versus safety argument, and you get this during wartime, and you also get this in this current situation. And each country's had to make its own decisions on this, but clearly the economic impact has been enormous. Just across every single advanced economy, but all the middle-income countries that I know of, I think only 2 of the ones I used to work on, they've actually managed positive growth. Rather surprising, Uzbekistan being one of them, but like plus 1% or something compared with their target was plus 10. So basically the world economy has been very badly hit. And one of the big issues is how quickly it will recover. There'll obviously be a bounce back immediately, but there'll be interesting issues like supply chains having been disrupted, whether people will go more local rather than, global, or whether Chinese participation in those global supply chains will also be, one of the issues that countries face up to. Lots of interesting questions. I think the thing we haven't discussed, and I would like to put it on the table, is institutional change. I think we've talked about vaccine sharing and financing and so on, but a big issue for me, it seems to me, and it's one that I'm working on as part of the WHO Pan-European Commission, it's chaired by Mario Monti, the former Italian Prime Minister, is looking at what sort of institutional change do we need for exactly what Carl said. This is not going to be the last pandemic. This will come back. If you model all the others, they all came back in some way or another. And so how do we reduce the risk of future pandemics and combat them more effectively? Now, as it happens, we have got lessons from other global public bads, like climate change, like the financial crisis. We did make institutional change. In the case of climate, it took more than 20 years from the Stockholm summit in 72 to the Rio one in 92 before changes started happening. Financial crisis actually responded much more quickly. So what we're going to recommend, almost certainly, in this Pan-European Commission is, first of all, we do need an international scientific committee on health threats, modeled on the climate change scientific committee. We do need to improve and strengthen the surveillance of health systems, which probably means more of a compulsory involvement by WHO, a bit like the IMF's Article 4 surveillance, to look at health systems and to look at their linkage with food and agriculture, animal health, those sorts of things. And there was some element of this in the G7 declaration, actually, which is, that part of it was welcome, I think, this weekend. We also should create, in our view, a G20 Global Health Board modeled on the Financial Stability Board. This would identify failures in the provision of global goods like vaccines and so on, and help with preparedness and response as well. And also, we need to ramp up investment in global public goods for exactly the reasons Marko said. This is actually, it's really interesting if you look at, really interesting, worrying, if you look at multilateral development banks like the one I led, EBRD, the amount of financing in this area is very low, actually, relative to other types of global goods. So we're thinking that we should recommend that COVAX becomes a permanent mechanism, that much more investment in health systems, in R&D and innovation by the multilateral development banks and others. That, I think, has to accompany institutional change. Otherwise, the new institutions won't have the firepower to deal with these things. So we'll have to have a duality of institutional change and reform, modeled on climate change and financial crisis, but dealing with pandemics, plus huge scale-up of investment from multilateral organizations in particular. to help, particularly emerging markets, cope with this in future.
Suma, if I could just push back on you a little bit, COVAX has not really been seen as a success so far, so why should we make it permanent?
Well, because it needs to become a success. It's not the fault of the actual model, in my view. I'm afraid it's the issue with the main financiers of the model and the suppliers. So it's a mechanism that I think it's going to have to mature and succeed, but I think it can do, provided its key participants actually really commit to doing so over a long period. They might find it easier to commit over a longer period than over the short term because of their own fiscal issues. So that's why I think it's the best game in town. I think we should build on it.
Carl, do you agree? Do you think it will be easier to make the longer term case? And have you figured out a pitch that will convince other European and the other European countries and the US to pony up more?
Well, I hope that we can get them to sort of contribute more immediately in terms of both money and vaccine sharing. That remains to be seen, but that is ongoing work. But then I very much agree with Suma, the agenda that he spells out, and I can add quite a lot to it on what is needed to do thereafter in order to set up new international mechanisms. I mean, we need a and there are quite a number of reports on the table already, and we are going to have a special session of the World Health Assembly in November to deal with these issues in pandemic treaty and a sort of pandemic radar or surveillance systems and financial resources immediately available so we can order vaccines not after 3 months, but after 3 days, so that we can fully fund or supply the COVAX. I mean, COVAX is an excellent idea, but I mean, if you should distribute vaccines, you need to have vaccines. And even if we are now ramping up production of vaccines like sort of a historical dimensions, we face a lot of problems. I mean, we face trade restrictions, we face vaccine nationalism, we face some supply constraints. So there are lots of lessons to be learned in the middle of us dealing with crisis management as we are doing on a daily or weekly basis in order to fight this. We need to sort of start to add up the long agenda, the long list of things that needs to be done and decided next year, when we hopefully are in a better situation to prevent this from recurring. And that Europe plays a role, needless to say. UK is an important actor, not only because of G7, but there's other reasons as well. China, Russia, I mean, all of the other battles that we fight must be sort of put aside for the battle against the virus and setting up those particular structures.
That's a great segue, actually, to one of our questions that came in through the app, and it's from I'm so sorry, I'm going to mispronounce this name, Nadad Nejvesti. I'm sorry, I seriously apologize. But anyway, the question is: vaccine manufacturers do not want to share vaccine production with others and invoke the right to patent protection. But is it actually some kind of monopoly?
No, but that's in my opinion wrong. They are sharing vaccine production on a, I don't have the numbers, but I think we have 20 or 30 or 40 technology sharing agreements. I mean, most of production is outsourced to other vaccine manufacturing at the moment. The problem that is there is often a problem now of sort of manpower, of sufficient quality control. If you do this too fast, you lose. I mean, these are complicated things. I mean, it's not that you do it at home in the kitchen, to put it mildly. One sort of stock of vaccines that you do takes roughly 3 months. It's a biological process. You have 100 quality checks. And if things go wrong, as we saw an example at a big facility in Baltimore, everything is destroyed. And there will be tens and tens of millions of doses that are sort of destroyed in that particular small mistake in Baltimore. But we have sort of outsourced vaccine production now all over the world with a speed that is unprecedented. If we take this sort of intellectual property issue, that can be discussed. But that's going to take a long time to have any effect. I mean, if one lifts those particular protections and start to build greenfield factories for vaccine production, start to recruit and train people, you will have an effect on supply in, say, 2 years' time. That's nice in 2 years' time. I'm not going to say that we're all going to be dead, but that's to exaggerate. But I mean, it's now that we need it, and then we have to deal. As Donald Rumsfeld said, you have to fight the war of the day with the army that you have. And we have to fight this particular pandemic with the instruments that we have.
Marko, you want to weigh in after we've heard the words of the former George W. Bush's defense secretary? Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that, I think the best recommendation for Carl for this new job was that he, has to deal with Balkans. So if you can deal with Balkans, the virus is nothing. So basically, maybe who knows? But I totally agree with that. What I think is that I'm happy that political leaders in my country, president and the prime minister, they thought out of the box, and they was able to think out of the box. But I'm not a happy man if this is not leading to improving the box, because it's not a good game. Thinking out of the box is always good if you have the box. So let us think about the box. And then, if you see the 80s, the last century. I totally remind me the whole vaccination race is actually, and not only vaccination, but the whole corona race, is actually reminding me on the 80s and trying to settling the arm race. We need to deal like this. We need to sit down and say, hey, international rules has to be established. If I want to build a factory in any country, including Serbia, for the production, I will have to fight with the same building permits, bureaucracy, as anywhere in the world, and it will not, who cares if it is for the vaccine or if it's for anything else. I will have to fight the old bureaucratic issues if I want to go to testing and so on. So we have to find international rules which are obliged for everybody. And that is not the case, and not a question if you're in China or in Russia or in the States. But this is the only way to cope with that. And this is actually improving the box. I think so. So this is basically what we need really to think about it, how we will manage it to rebuild the box in the way that we are able to face the challenges, because they are here. We are not we are not speaking now about something which is in the future. We are speaking about you see the people with the masks and everything. So I spent 2.5 hours just to come in and to register for this. I was like, Zoom, come back, everything is forgiven, I like you. So, but nevertheless, we managed it somehow. And now I think we have to really, really think about how we will do it in the future. And, there are a lot of questions. How will the industry 4.0 look like in the future? Are we able to transfer the technologies to other markets which are not able on themselves to have these solutions? Now, it's not only vaccine patent rights. I totally agree with this is the framework of now. But what is the framework? Do we have an answer of this framework? Do we have something what we will exchange this framework? I don't see this kind of discussion.
Right, I'm going to give Suma the floor and just give a heads up to the folks on the floor that we do have a question there. So let's get the mic over to that person. But Suma, can you weigh in? This discussion of a TRIPS waiver is quite a fiery one, and it was implied by our last question. Where do you stand there?
I'm in favor of the waiver. I think we've got to do everything we can to get vaccine production up. And I think the waiver is a part of the arsenal of instruments to try and do that. But Carl's right. In all WTO discussions that I've ever been involved with, this is not like an overnight decision. To try and build a consensus for that will take some months, and we haven't got months to wait. So that can only be one of the instruments, more a medium-term one, I think.
All right, thank you. And let's go to our question on the floor, please. Please stand up.
Fabian Saar with the European Border and Coast Guard. Thank you so much. European border or any border management hasn't really been mentioned so far. I was wondering about your perspectives. If we do accept that we're not even halfway there, we do also probably know that more variants will come about. Where does European border management come in? From the Serbian perspective, what does that mean for your business or the UK? I mean, we already have this dynamic right now. Thank you so much.
Well, I think that if you talk about sort of connectivity, and we are a far more connected world these days, I mean, we can manage that. I mean, all of us, or most of us who have come here, or those of us who come by air, for example, I mean, you have to test before you go on the aircraft, and sometimes when you get off the aircraft. I mean, that's perfectly possible to do. And we have sort of new testing equipment and new testing technologies that are coming that are sort of both easier to do and cheaper. So I think we can make the global air traffic system safer. I mean, nothing is 100%, but more or less 100%. That's doable. Borders, I mean, we have other flows of migration across borders that we can't control anyhow. That's a challenge. But the more testing, I was going to make that note. A lot of discussion about vaccines, I understand that. All of the politics is about vaccines. I stress testing, because if we don't test, we are flying blind. We don't know what's happening. If we know what's happening, then we can take action. So if we test far more on your borders, then we know what's happening and then we can take action. So I'm not entirely pessimistic on the possibilities of handling that challenge.
Marko?
If you ask about the borders, and I will return to my company metaphor on the European continents, we are becoming expensive. Our transaction costs are becoming expensive. Our logistical costs are becoming expensive. It has not to do only with Serbia or Croatia or Denmark. It's about transaction costs with the Eurozones, non-Eurozones, between Europe and non-EU countries or emerging Europe. It is the logistical costs between the European countries. So basically, what are the answers on that? So the businesses, what they can do is they can only do what they can do. We are thinking about the new logistical approaches, using more rivers, using more vertical harbors on the seaside. So trying to cope with these challenges. But again, I don't see any discussion how we will face these problems, because it will shape our economy. It will make us uncompetitive in the world where other large companies have no problem with accessing the markets everywhere on their part of the interest zone. So basically, this is a huge question. The borders are the huge question. Are we ready to introduce single markets also to the countries which are on their way to Europe and which are establishing the European standards like the Western Balkans, mini Schengen, everything, as a European Union, even before the Western Balkans is able to become politically full member? Are we ready to do that or not? I don't know.
Marko, yeah, I read a piece that you wrote recently where you kind of saw vaccine diplomacy as a possible path to creating this Western Balkans mini Schengen. How's that going? And especially given that Kosovo has said they don't want Serbian vaccines because most of the Serbian vaccines are from Russia and China, and those countries don't recognize Kosovo as a country. So how are you navigating all this?
No, I can fully understand the people. That was the time when the government in Pristina was not even built, and pretty tough time for them. But we had thousands of entrepreneurs from Kosovo vaccinated in Serbia. The companies from Kosovo are vaccinated in Serbia, which is not a problem. We are not looking at it as a political issue. It's a humanitarian issue. And, this is the question. If the Russians you have to choose. Nobody actually, the most given vaccine in this regional business vaccination project that we had is AstraZeneca and BioNTech Pfizer, I think. And then after that, Sinopharm. So you could choose. It's not a problem. But the mini Schengen, the question of the region will be solved. So we will fail or we will succeed together with the European Union. We achieved now in these hard times to have waiting times on the borders for trucks under 1 hour or 1 hour and a half, but in between our borders of the West Balkan. But if you come to the EU border, this is 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours. So there is no answer only between us in the mini Schengen. It is the answer between us and the single market. Mm-hmm. Are we ready to that? Do we want to build the project of European success further, or what we want actually from Europe? I think this basic ideas and basic discussions, what we want from Europe actually, is also somehow needed to be done.
Mm-hmm. Suma, you talked about how China and others are kind of coming in with offers for this region. So, do you think the pandemic has brought the Western Balkans closer to Europe or further from Europe? And we only have a few minutes left, so.
Western Balkans. Well, I mean, I hope it's brought Western Balkans closer to Europe. But that's been my lifetime's objective, to try and get Europe and the Western Balkans much closer together. Look, I think what Marko has just said is really instructive. I think there's a division between goods and services, if you like, and between physical and non-physical. I think the physical side of goods and services, there are huge transaction costs. And probably the pandemic has actually increased those transaction costs. And the big focus should be on how digitization and others can actually reduce those transaction costs, so that human beings are less involved in the actual transactions as such across borders. On the non-physical, I think the service sector can continue pretty much because it's well digitized and doesn't really require human-to-human contact to some extent. The people side is going to be interesting, I think. I don't know whether lifestyle change will mean that there'll be less tourism, foreign tourism, for a while at least, because people are suspicious. Even in the UK, it was remarkably easy to get booking in Portugal, even when it's not a green country, because people are just not moving. People are not just going, actually, as much as we thought they would. And I think also in terms of for work, whether people in Europe are willing to move around as much as they were before, it's a great benefit of the UK economy in the past. Whether that's going to happen is, again, a rather open question. I think this is leading us inexorably towards some sort of proof of your vaccine status. I think it's very difficult to avoid it. And it's another one of those liberty versus control issues that's coming up, obviously. But I can't see how our economy is going to recover quickly unless we resolve those sorts of issues in favor of entrepreneurs like Marko and others, actually, to try and help them do their business more easily.
Carl, that last question is, has the pandemic brought the Western Balkans closer to Europe or further? What would you say?
I suspected that we're going to end up in the Balkans.
Welcome back.
Only 2 minutes left.
I think I hadn't thought about the issue, but I thought, broadly speaking, yes. Because there will be an awareness, Marko, correct me, there will be an awareness, or increasing awareness in the Balkans that sort of the nation ain't enough. I mean, I wouldn't say that Balkans is the only place where there have been a lot of nationalism, but there has certainly been an abundance of it in the Balkans. And now it's obvious that you need to, it is something wider than that. So I think that the forces of integration and cooperation, broadly speaking, will probably increase or have greater possibilities in the Balkans. And since the Balkans happens to be in Europe, on the balance, I think it's going to have a good effect. And then I hope, by the way, just to link up to the previous discussion, what's going to happen with the economy is, of course, slightly outside the topic of our conversation, is, of course, the digital development will take us a giant leap forward. That means that young people will take a giant leap forward, because young people are more... The big digital divide in the world is not between different geographies, it's between the different generations. And that means that sort of young people in the Balkans will probably take a leap forward and cooperate more across the whole boundaries. That's an optimistic take, which I sort of basically believe in.
Well, Carl, people are going to think that we choreographed this, because the next panel that is coming up at 10 to 4 is on digital democracy. So thank you for that excellent segue. Let's make that the last word, although I am going to quote Marko for my summation, this hunger to improve the box. Maybe great leaders in a crisis think outside the box, but I'm hearing, just as a major theme of this discussion, a desire to improve the box, especially when it comes to kind of international cooperation and institutions. So thanks so much to you, Carl, Marko, and Suma. I really appreciate you joining us. Thanks to you here in Bratislava, and those of you watching digitally. And if you're here with us, there are refreshments downstairs. See you at 3:50.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We sorted out everything.